Good morning, and thank you all for joining the third of a three-part webinar series hosted by the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, focused on the broader context in which the Compact has released its third update to its regionally unified sea level rise projection for Southeast Florida. We hope you were able to tune in to the first and second webinars hosted over the last 2 weeks, providing the technical foundations of the Unified Sea Level Rise projection, as well as how it has been applied in practice. But in case you missed it, a recording of the session and all presentations are posted on the Compact's website following the link in the chat window. I'm Steve Adams. I'm Director of Urban Resilience with the Institute for Sustainable Communities. We're an international nonprofit that works with communities in the United States and Asia to unearth locally driven and equitable climate solutions, focusing obviously on global climate change. For nearly a decade, ISD has partnered with the Climate Change Compact in Southeast Florida to provide implementation support for its work. Have no fear, Lauren Ordway is well. A minor health issue precludes her from leading today's webinar, so I'm standing in for her today. Since the Compact's inception in 2009, it has focused on aligning local government action to build resilience to climate change and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the four-county region of Broward, Miami-Dade, Monroe, and Palm Beach counties. In the Compact's early days, the partners recognized that the diversity of local sea level rise projections was a barrier to achieving regionally consistent adaptation strategies and policies, and effectively influencing supportive policies at the state and federal level. And thus, the Compact set out to develop a regionally consistent projection for the region. Since the projection was first developed in 2011, the Compact has released 2 updates to account for newly available climate science in 2015 and then again very late at 2019. Through the generous support of a technical advisory group consisting of scientific experts within the academic community, as well as staff from local, regional, and federal government agencies. The Compact also publishes an accompanying report providing specific guidance for application of the projection, as well as information on the technical methodology used to develop the projection. You can find this report on the Compact's website. This webinar series is designed to be iterative, with the content building upon itself. Our first webinar 2 weeks ago set the foundations for understanding the methodology and technical aspects that underpin the regional projection, as well as how to use the projection curves in practice. Last week's session focused on 7 examples of how sea level rise, the sea level rise projection has been applied across local government and regional agencies in South Florida. With the aim of showing the diversity of applications of this tool and the critical need to institutionalize the use of consistent, science-based, data-informed decision-making in the face of climate change risk. So as you'll see on the next slide, today's webinar will focus on the context into which the Compact has released its third update. Our discussions will take us beyond the technical aspects of the tool and its application, and we'll explore the use of the projection in the context of Florida's emerging statewide resilience policy and legislation, communicating about risk and uncertainty with communities and the critical need for engagement and co-creation of solutions with frontline communities, and making the case for continued equitable investments and adaptation even amid the pandemic and other tumults of 2020 thus far. With the projection, while the projection is indeed a technical tool frequently used to inform and design infrastructure, it is critical that we keep in mind why we develop and use this tool in the first place. The people of Southeast Florida are increasingly exposed to risks related to rising seas, and we know that these risks are borne disproportionately by frontline communities experiencing climate change worst and first due to existing inequities and socioeconomic disparities. People's lives, safety, daily movement, sense of community, and security are all at risk, and at the center of our efforts to plan for a more resilient future for all. So just a few housekeeping notes here from me before I turn it over to our first speaker. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the Compact's website after this session concludes. All attendees are muted. If you have technical difficulties, use the Q&A box and someone will reach out to you to help resolve whatever issue you may be experiencing. Please use the Q&A function to ask a question at any point during a speaker's presentation. After each session, we will have time for questions. We will get to as many questions as possible, but given the number of attendees, it's unlikely that we'll be able to get to all the questions. Finally, a link to the agenda and our speakers' full bios and emails are provided here in the chat bar for your reference. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Whitney Gray. Whitney currently serves as the administrator of the Florida Resilient Coastlines Program at the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, where she works to bring sea level rise resilience planning to the forefront of the department's activity for the long-term benefit of the people and ecosystems of Florida. It's great to have you with us today, Whitney. Thank you. Take it away.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here. Nice to see you, and know that all of my South Florida friends are there. It's I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. I think the work that's been done in Southeast Florida has really set the tempo, set the bar for the rest of the state. I know that I look to you all and the wealth of information that you have developed and the way that you're implementing that information as an example for how to move the rest of the state. So thank you very much for all the work that you've done and for inviting me here today. Let's go to the next slide, please. I want to start today by talking just for a couple of minutes about the Florida Resilient Coastlines Program, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the projections, the unified projections, have been implemented. And of course, you already know a lot of that from the session last week. And I'm going to follow up at the end talking about a piece of legislation that was signed by the governor yesterday and that DEP will have responsibility for implementing. So the Florida Resilient Coastlines Program was started about 2.5 years ago, December of 2017, and really was intended to try to bring together all of the community resilience planning and natural resource protection tools at the disposal of DEP to help coastal communities deal with the effects of climate change and sea level rise, coastal flooding, erosion, and all of those things. And so we have worked over the last couple of years to pull together several pieces that make the program up that really try to address coastal communities' needs. Next slide, please. And those three sort of aspects of our program have to do with, include technical resources and technical assistance, funding, of course, everybody's favorite part, and coordination. Next slide, please. In the category of technical assistance, one of the main resources that we have to offer is the Florida Adaptation Planning Guidebook, which was the final product of a multi-year project that was funded by NOAA and implemented through DEP and DEO to really devise some best practices for adaptation planning in the state of Florida, specific to Florida. And what you see here on the slide is sort of the pathway that we recommend that communities take through their vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategies and prioritizing those implementation strategies. We have the publication of this Florida Adaptation Planning Guidebook. It's available as a hard copy that's at no charge that we can send to you, and it's also available as a PDF on our website. These are recommended steps, but as I mentioned, they were devised through research and talking with experts in planning throughout the state of Florida. And I'm sure that many of you on the call today were involved in those processes starting back in 2011. Next slide, please. Another form of technical assistance that we have is provided by my colleague Joe Bauer, who reaches out to coastal communities to offer in-person training on a variety of decision support tools, including the ones that you see here. Understanding how these tools work and how to use the data and visualizations that they provide helps local governments to develop meaningful resilience plans and to communicate with their citizens so that they get appropriate public input. Joe and I are working to coordinate our programs even better in hopefully to help provide a comprehensive package of technical assistance to coastal communities. Next slide, please. Another part, arguably everybody's favorite part of my program, is the grants. We offer resilience planning grants, and we will be offering a new line of grants starting in the grant cycle that opens on August 1st, resilience implementation grants. So far, since 2017, late 2017, early 2018, we have served over 67 projects with over $4 million that's funding from the state and federal government. Our funding now comes all from the state of Florida. It's a line item in the state budget. We are quite pleased that our line item did not get vetoed this year, so we will have funding available for our 2021 grants, and we'll be making those award announcements very soon. As I mentioned, the grants available for the 21-22 fiscal year will open on August 1st on a new online grant application portal. And I have information about a July webinar that can inform you more, or July 15th, I should say, it's already July, webinar that can inform you more about our next series of grants. The map shows all the different locations of grants that we have funded over the lifetime of the program. Next slide, please. My favorite aspect of this, and I would say arguably one of the most important parts, is the coordination piece. This is a partial list of the communities and organizations, the universities, the state and federal agencies that join together on a quarterly webinar called the Coastal Resilience Forum. This has become quite a community of practice, I think. We typically have a webinar once every quarter where we talk about what's new in resilience across the state, and then have time for participants to make announcements or ask questions of the group in kind of a group sharing mode. One of the things that we've done recently is had a special edition just a couple of weeks ago where we highlighted several other grant programs from DEP that can assist local governments in improving their resilience. And all of the webinar information from the forum and in all its different episodes can be found on our website as well, and on our Coastal Resilience Forum webpage. Next slide. So what I'm really here to talk about today is the sea level rise projections in context and the local examples and sort of what's coming next. Next slide. One of the things I wanted to point out is that in a recent study that was performed for DEP by Florida State University's Department of Urban and Regional Planning, a survey of coastal communities was conducted to determine the extent of sea level rise planning activities. And 73% of the respondents reported that they already have sea level rise language in their comprehensive plans or in the process of developing such language. And about a third of respondents also know that sea level rise is referenced in their building codes, land development codes, capital improvement plan, or flood prevention ordinance. And I think this is one of the most direct impacts of having the unified sea level rise projection is not just having it or having decided upon it, but the ways in which it is actually implemented or made actionable in the community's codified ordinances and codes and so forth. Next slide, please. And as you all already know, I'm sure, in Broward County, the county's regional resilience standards have recently been put into action. Broward County uses the projections to set a height based on a reasonable lifespan of the seawall, and the seawall ordinance encourages nature-based solutions. They say at a waterward face, construct with natural lime rock riprap or other approved habitat enhancement. They want constructors to enhance the biological value of the flat surface seawalls and really add some value to them and not just have it be a barrier that precludes habitat. They've also actionalized, I'm going to make up a word here, actionalized the projections by using them to set higher finished floor elevations and drainage and water management standards. Next slide, please. Another example, which particularly focused on changing the vertical NGVD to the NAVD 88. This is, there we go, thanks. This is a huge shift and updates it to make a more updated, newer, more accurate standard, and it corrects mistakes that were made in the development of the 1920s standard, and now it uses satellites to make the measurements. So Miami is poised to make the switch with their new ordinance. Next slide, please. What's coming next is pretty big. Senate Bill 178 was signed by the governor yesterday and is an effort to ensure that public financing of construction in the coastal area is money well spent. Next slide, please. What you see here is a diagram of the different zones, different coastal construction zones in the coastal zone. And the bill requires several things. It requires DEP to do some things, and it requires constructors to do some things. The bill applies to construction projects within that coastal building zone, which you can see outlined from the seasonal high water line well inland. I believe that stretches about 1,500 feet. And the projects that are using funds that are appropriated from the state are the ones that have to conduct a sea level impact study before starting construction. It is up to DEP to devise this sea level impact study and to implement that and provide a way to document the results of those studies. The study will have to be conducted by the constructor and submitted to DEP and published on DEP's website for at least 30 days before construction can start. And the requirements of the bill are not retroactive, so this will all take effect after the rule is established and set up to go. Next slide, please. So among some of the requirements of the bill, as I said, there are some things that DEP has to do. One of those things is we have to adopt rules, establishing the standards for these studies. And of course, as rule development goes, there will be many opportunities for public input on how the standards should be developed. And the standards have to include certain requirements. And one of the things that I noticed about the bill is that it really emphasizes using data-based and fact-based studies, or practices that take
Hi, Whitney. We seem to be having some bandwidth issues. Perhaps if you turned off your video, feed, we could,
professional engineer sign off on this.
okay, it looks like we're having bandwidth issues in Tallahassee. Let's wait a moment to see if we can recapture. Just awaiting another little increment here and seeing if we can recapture. Okay. I'm told that Whitney is rejoining us. Whitney.
Please.
Whitney Gray, do we have you?
Hi, Steve. Can you hear me?
I can, yes. Okay, Whitney. Perhaps we've lost you again. Okay, I apologize for the bandwidth issues. I think we will continue to see if we can reconnect with Whitney. Hopefully her internet provider can sort out whatever is going on there in Tallahassee. But at this point, I think we will move on. We had a couple of outstanding questions already coming in for Whitney, and this bill that she was discussing is of great interest to many. So we will attempt to find an opportunity in order to get some questions back before Whitney, before we go. All right, so I'm going to move us right along. I am not going to attempt to answer the questions that came in for Whitney. I would just be making it up. So we're going to move now to a panel exploring another issue that I think is of critical importance: communicating sea level rise, risk, and uncertainty, listening to community concerns, and co-creating solutions. So as statistician George Box once famously said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. The Compact's 2019 sea level rise projection that we've been rolling out in this webinar series is a bundle of modeled futures that contain our best understanding of what climate change driven sea level rise will look like in Southeast Florida over the rest of the century. It's wrong in the sense that we cannot with precision tell you exactly what the Key West tide gauge will measure in, say, 2068, as we don't know what future greenhouse gas emission pathways the planet will take, among other uncertainties. It can be useful, however, in the sense that projections give us some sense of our future risks, but only if that information that it contains within these projections can be effectively communicated to everyone in the spirit of ensuring that we can co-create solutions together. The business of communicating risk to our community members, to our elected officials, and to practitioners who need to understand possible future conditions is the incredibly important bit that makes any future looking model useful. Joining me to explore these issues are Yoka Arditi Rocha, the Executive Director of the Clio Institute, arguably the state's leading climate literacy organization that has been at it for over a decade now. Dr. Suzanne Moser, Susie Moser with Suzanne Moser Research and Consulting, a longtime friend and colleague, and I'm delighted that Susie has been joining us for this. And then, of course, Katie Hagerman. Katie is the Resilience Program Manager for Miami-Dade County, where she is leading the county's sea level rise adaptation strategy and doing what I would characterize as the real hard work of moving issues along and getting things done in partnership. So I can see Yoka, I can see Katie, and do we have Susie on screen as well? There's
Yes.
Susie. All right, there you are. So hopefully everyone can see our panelists. Wonderful. So Yoka, you're at the helm of Florida's foremost climate literacy nonprofit, as I noted in your intro, where you are in the business of translating knowledge into a potent reservoir for action. You're working on climate justice issues with Black and Brown communities. You're working with kids, teachers, and schools, and you're working with state and local governments to move the needle. In the decade that Clio has been operating, how have you used the previous 2 regional sea level rise projections produced by the Compact in your work? And what have you found to be the most effective ways to communicate climate science to engender action?
Thank you, Steve, and Lauren and everybody at the Compact for having us today. Indeed, I mean, it's been a decade now that Clio has been working throughout the state of Florida, building climate literacy. We should be celebrating birthdays together because we are as old as the Compact itself. So we, for those of you who don't know Clio, we're the only nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with state presence now, not only in South Florida, but in Central Florida and North Florida, building climate literacy and fostering education into action. We always felt that education is power and that building community resilience and adaptive capacity requires an informed, engaged, and prepared public. And so Clio has been approaching climate literacy and advocacy in a very interdisciplinary and holistic manner that not only addresses adaptation, responding to the climate crisis, but also mitigation, addressing at the root of the problem of the climate crisis with equal intensity. We feel that one cannot happen without the other. And so we create multiple access points to engage different audiences, understanding so they can understand that there are scalable solutions, and also making sure that the ones that are going to be that are already at the forefront facing the brunt impacts of the climate crisis are not left behind. And we come with a world-class expert council advisory, and in our trainings we synthesize complex science that for many is very abstract and make it into consumable, easy to understand information for the lay public. I mean, we use data from the most reputable scientific organizations like NOAA and NASA, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and also the Compact. And so we've been using the sea level rise projections in our trainings for many, many years. And most of our trainings start with the basics of climate science, the Climate Science 101, where we explain, what greenhouse gases are, and we call them heat trapping gases to make it easier for people to understand what the greenhouse gas effect is. How do scientists have been studying the Earth climates in the hundreds of thousands of years? Why are carbon pollution and our dirty fuel-based economy is warming up our planet? And then we go into the impacts, why land ice is melting, why our oceans are warming, what are the implications, why is that making our sea levels rise? What is happening with saltwater intrusion, and what's the implication of our water security? And why are hurricanes intensifying so rapidly? And also now, why are they slowing down? What are causing these rain bomb events that we're seeing more and more frequently? And so we make those really complex, abstract impacts and science into something very easy for people to understand. So when we're talking about ocean thermal expansion, we use the analogy of when you left a pot of water, unattended, and the volume of the water raises up. And so we try to make things that very easy, but also wanted to make sure that people understand not only the causes of climate crisis, the implications, but also the solutions, and how they all must be part of it, and that they have superpowers to take care of this. The power of their voices, the power of their purse, the power of their time, the power of their choices, but most importantly, the power of their voice. We believe in educational action, and this is one of the reasons I firmly believe in our mission, because it's beautiful to see in a crowd of people in a community event, see that cloud lift and those aha moments when people really make and connect those dots. The average resident finally understands what's happening to our Earth system, what is causing it, how it's affecting them directly or indirectly, and what they can do about it. And because, to really quote the Jacques Cousteau, I think it's really to understand the root of our mission, because you only protect what you love, and you only love what you understand, and you only understand what you're taught. And so that's why we believe so much in the power of climate education.
Wonderful. Thank you, Yoka. So Katie, you're leading what I'd call the real stuff of sea level rise adaptation in Miami County. You're working directly with communities across the county to design projects to reduce impacts in building the county's larger sea level rise strategy. The regional projections are clearly at the front end of what you're bringing to the table, but clearly it's not the whole of what you're bringing. What other tools or data are you using to communicate risks and benefits? We can't hear you, Katie.
Sorry, I was on mute. So thank you so much again for having me and for those kind words. So the projections that we certainly use are at the center of the work that we do. They're really helpful, especially for the professional architects and engineers that are familiar with the technical work. But as you mentioned, when we're speaking with our communities and broadly with our colleagues, even professionals, the curves, the projections aren't really easily understood right away. Obviously, sea level rise isn't a phenomenon that we have observed personally. We have memories of floods, but when you talk about having 2 feet of water across the landscape, and that's very difficult for people to get their minds around. And so I think the model that we've tried to use, and we'll try and do more of because we've only done the tip of the iceberg, is that trying to use visuals as much as possible, and also to talk about what is a sort of vision of a future adaptive society looking like. So talk about different scenarios. Do we want to build and look more like the Florida Keys? Do we want to, kind of use that approach for adapting and trying to use visuals, and also an interactive workshop format, which we've partnered with Clio and others to do those kinds of workshops. Again, where we're trying to take, for example, our tools like elevating buildings or elevating seawalls and break them down into icons and maps, and really focus on a specific place so that everyone has the ability to participate in the conversation. Often I think it's a mistake to think of these issues as an engineering problem that engineers need to address, or another professional discipline of an urban planning problem that urban planners need to address. So to try and make it a more open space and a fair space for lots of people to participate in, try and distill it down, because I think that the concepts people can understand. It's just that the language that we use around them is often what's hardest to get your mind around. So, but I think one of the things that's hardest about this, and others encounter all the time, is that there can be the need to have the same conversation multiple times. So, you know, we're fortunate in South Florida, people are already aware of climate change, thanks to the work of Cleo and others, aware of sea level rise. But even when we have communities where they see their own street repeatedly flooding, it's still a barrier to understand this is permanent. This isn't going away. We can't drain this away. And then, and so there's kind of a psychological and like a longer term process to sort of accept that this is what is happening. It's a global force, and that we have to, we can take steps locally, but they are often big and they're often expensive, and it's not something that the city can easily fix. So that's, I think, the harder process. But, you know, I think we have really good models here of how to do it. The question is just we need to scale it up and keep having those conversations and back and forth about so that we can have a broader participation in terms of designing and deciding, and then ultimately paying for the changes that need to happen.
Thanks, Katie. So I want to bring in Dr. Moser. So Susie, break this down for us. You're an incredible academic. You don't just really rouse things up in the ivory tower. You're out in the streets and you're out with practitioners on a regular basis. And you're incredibly accomplished, both in terms of the climate communications front. You've made significant contributions there in communicating risk, as well as in the practice of adaptation. Clearly a member of my personal pantheon of heroes. Too often, I think, our theory of change is that good science, well presented, will drive rational decision making. We've seen this repeatedly for 20 years. How do real humans behave, not as the Vulcan High Council, if you will, but how do they interact really and truly with risk-based information? And how do we think about other intervening psychological, social, and economic factors, particularly systemic racism, wealth disparities, and access to opportunity as they come into play for individuals and for communities?
Wow, you just raised a whole lot of things. So thank you first, Steve, for those words. I think I'm going to hire you as my communication director. Well, I guess let me start out by simply saying, you know, the use of the best science in decision-making is rational. That's a good thing. I don't want to, you know, diminish that part, right? But we shouldn't equate that with thinking that the best decisions only need science. In fact, this is something that I often tell my physical science friends that tend to forget, that neuroscience, social science has demonstrated conclusively that the best decisions actually require the left and the right part of the brain. In other words, it needs the rational analysis and creativity. It needs cognition and feelings. You know, if we don't have one or the other, just imagine that. And this is in fact how people have found this out, through people who had brain damage to one hemisphere. They could not make a good decision. You need both, right? So that's a really important thing, that we don't assume that the science is the only thing that we need. I think that what you're trying to get at is really, how do we get people's attention, right? The stuff that starts prior to decision making. So many of us are so distracted by other things, particularly right now. Who has time to focus, or the mental space to focus on, you know, complicated science facts? As you just heard from Yoko and Katie, it's, you know, you have to find a way to get in. And it's really important to know for all of us that we don't just take scientific facts, you know, as they are. We all filter them through a whole bunch of filters, I guess, in our heads. And that we do that, and we can use that very fact through things like framing. I'll come back to that in a moment, or through mental models. You just heard Yoko speak of pollution, right? Think about that for a moment. When you think pollution, you think of CO2 instantly in a particular category of things. You know, pollution is bad. Pollution comes out of tailpipes, comes out of smokestacks. We have to stop that. That's what we've been trained to think of. And that's a really helpful way to get people to make sense to, oh, this is bad, we should do something about it, right? So it immediately sort of makes you lean toward a receptive way of thinking about it. And the same we can do, you know, you heard Katie talk about the analogy of the pot that's boiling over it when it expands, when you heat up the fluid, right? Everyone knows that example everyone has had milk spill on their stove. So, you know, it just resonates, and that's a way that we can use. So one of the ways in which Florida and Southeast Florida in particular has talked about climate change, has gotten a lot of attention, is to frame it as an economic thing, right? We've heard it as the cost of action versus inaction. And wow, that has really gotten a whole bunch of people on board. Now, it's not just a cost of action or inaction. You might also think about job opportunities. You might think about affordability. Who does it speak to? It's a very different crowd, right? Even within these economic frames. What if I framed it as a, you know, we need to take care of our children's future? What if I framed it as a social justice, as a climate justice issue? It speaks to very different people. And that's the other side of the brain. That's not about the science. That's about how do you make this resonant? What's the door through which you want to bring people into the conversation? And that is totally audience specific. I can't give you, you know, here's the one silver bullet framing of this and it works for everyone. It won't. You know, if you're completely right now engulfed in anti-racism work, then the economics, yeah, that, you know, only through that justice frame will that make sense. If you're right now completely in a COVID space, the way you can make that resonant is what's the resilience, what's the health impacts of not having water security, not having, you know, safe streets, whatever, being more at risk during a hurricane, that sort of thing. So you kind of can use what's happening at the time, you can use what matters to that particular audience to make this information relevant to people. And I guess that's the way to go. And it's hard work, just as hard as figuring out the modeling.
Thanks, Susie. So each of you have had extensive experience in engaging various audiences and perhaps in using different frames, as Susie just suggested. I'd love for each of you, starting with Yoka, and we'll move back through the panel, I'd love to hear from each of you an example of a particular community engagement event in which you were involved, either facilitating or observing, that from your perspective went exceedingly well. What clicked and what created the magic in terms of the folks who were running the process? Yoka.
Thanks. You know, I do so agree with Susie's comments, because as communicators, and we're in the business, Clio is in the business of communication and education. And our mission is to educate and promote and inform and engage public that supports climate action. And for years, we have played a role helping local governments, communities, and business to roll up their sleeve and work together. But the connecting the dots between climate change and vulnerability related to extreme heat, health, food disparities, water, economics, and extreme weather events. You know, early in our work, we noticed that there were some voices and groups missing. And after Clio, together with many other partners, advocated for the creation of Miami-Dade County's County of Resilience, we got a grant to work in communities that are facing the brunt of the crisis and that are on the front lines. Unfortunately, not only on the front lines of the climate crisis, but also on the front lines of the current health pandemic we are experiencing, and also the victims of systemic racism and disparities we're facing in our country. And since then, Clio has advanced the resilience and climate justice agenda in the region. And in 2017, Steve, you may remember, we led a community summit where we brought in elected officials, local residents, NGOs, thinkers, planners, social workers at the Perez Art Museum to craft climate and equity recommendations for the compact to ensure that municipalities were thinking of the equity lens and we came out with 22 recommendations, equity recommendations for the compact. And some of those, are being applied as we speak. But if there's something that the current times are really telling us is, number one, we can no longer ignore science. We all know that, and we should at least know that. Dismissing science and denying science is no longer acceptable. Number two, that all of these parallels are intrinsically related. And that to really understand that for a community to be truly resilient, we must not leave anyone behind. And so I think, throughout the years, we've had, more than 1,300 trainings and forums, and in our collective effort, we have, now chambers of commerce redefining resilience, educators weaving climate across the curriculums, and we have youth demanding climate emergency declarations in city halls these days. But most importantly, I think we have some of the most underserved communities finally have a voice and having a seat at the table. Not saying that the work is done, is actually beginning, but I think being able to have given them these communities a voice, it's something that we feel very proud of, and we continue to work and encourage, all the municipalities listening here, that to really look at those equity, that equity framework that we work in such a diverse and inclusive, summit. And so we're really proud of that.
Thanks, Yuka. Katie.
Sure. So I think that the two are all that come to mind are also at the Perez Art Museum. So I think we should host all of our events there. But this last year, one in partnership with Clio and then another working with the Dutch consulate, we had workshops that were focused on sea level rise adaptation, but working specifically with students. And with each of those student groups, asked them to focus on a particular area or a typology in Miami-Dade County, so the beach or the sloughs or downtown, and then match up with our different tools, have a discussion about which of these adaptation tools that they think would make the most sense that they want to apply in their focus area. And we had in a workshop a lot of a lot of experts, coastal engineers, Henk Ovink, who's like the Dutch water ambassador, very senior people. But I think it was a really helpful format to have about half and half students and professionals, and they were high school graduate and undergraduate students, and to have a back and forth, because I think that the issue of climate change, the high school students in particular we've worked with through Clio, they ask the right questions. So as we were talking about different options, for example, at my table we were talking about the Little Havana area, and I was talking about, well, one of the options that we have is to raise the area on fill, and one of the girls just looked at me and was like, but if we raise it on fill, won't we just have to do it again in just a few years? It's like, well, yes. yes, you will. But, these are, just the questions that they ask have a different lens, because I think, they're, it's more personal, but also, more appreciation for the impact that this will have on themselves in a way that I think, unfortunately, isn't always the first reaction of those who are a little more senior. So I think that, I hope that we have the opportunity to do more events like that, where we can bring in more of a useful perspective and especially framing the conversation. I think that the real challenge, though, is to find a more effective way to bridge the really good ideas and really thoughtful ideas that come through those types of workshops and design engagements and the public forums, and connect them with the actual decision-making process for infrastructure, large expenditures that are often made in an institutional setting where that feedback can't be given as easily. Because I think, it's very, not easy, but it is possible in a specific forum for us to identify, well, what are the best practices for adapting to sea level rise? What will we like our communities to look like? But it's hard to translate that vision into some of the decision-making processes where maybe a staff member only has permission to look at certain things like a concrete wall that has been used in other places and has already been built, and they don't have permission from the institution where they work to look at things that are more innovative. So I think it's a constant challenge for us to keep trying to connect these great engagements and the fantastic work that's being done by Cleo and yourselves and others, and try and integrate that into the actual decision making about double-decking a highway out to Miami Beach, or these other large multi-million-dollar decisions that are being made, but often in a parallel process to some of these conversations.
Thanks, Katie. And Susie.
I think what you just raised, Katie, that issue of making the link between our engagement and the decision making is really the crux of where it's at. And so I haven't worked in Florida lately. I'm gonna not be able to give you a local example, but I think I'm gonna give you one that you can all very much relate to. So I worked for about 18 months in the city of Homer, Alaska, which for those of you who are interested in that, they were the first people in this country, first city to actually develop a climate action plan in 2005, and it was a little outdated. They wanted to update that, and they wanted to actually take adaptation seriously. So we started a process of working with NOAA to train local staff on, what is all this adaptation stuff about? It's like there's too much staff turnover, you need to do that. So we had that first, and then we had a workshop that was all about what do we want to achieve, visioning. It was, the community was involved. It was a wonderful workshop. We all felt really good about ourselves. And then we heard through the grapevine that basically the planner, who it was just about to start a comprehensive plan update and was part of this process, he went back home and he just, to his office, and he didn't know, well, what am I going to do with that? I mean, it's just that the distance between doing the vulnerability assessment and looking at scenarios and then planning this gorgeous future, and then he comes home and he has to, do his regular job, right? And climate change isn't in the job description, and it's not in the plan guidance or anything like that. So the third time we came back, we said, okay, forget all that. That was useful, but let's start with, where does the boat leak? And I kind of use that metaphor as a, just as a joke kind of thing. It turned out they actually had a leaking boat in the harbor. It was really problematic. Anyway, the point being, we started with problems that they were facing. And because we knew that's actually what, when he goes back to the office, he has to address. And then we used what we had done before and said, okay, if you wanted to address that problem, that boat leaking that's in your harbor, how would you do that? What are the things right in front of you? What are your options? And then we tested those options against, does it fit with your vision? Is it a step in that direction? If not, how would you have to modify it? And second test, would it work under the different climate scenarios that we looked at? Given uncertainty, we talked about that earlier. We can't get around it. So you have to make decisions today. And can you make that in a way that works in light of the different ways in which climate could turn out? So we had this vision test, and we had the climate test. And once we did that, it led to modifications of whatever he would do to fix the problem that was at his doorstep. And then we attached very specific indicators and metrics of progress and success to those actions so that the community could track whether or not he's doing that, addressing current problems while also being climate conscious. And it worked. Those metrics and indicators are now in the comprehensive plan, and it's being implemented. So it's a very direct way in which we tried what you just said, Katie, about trying to bridge the engagement with the day-to-day decision making.
It's a very practical approach. So I want to pivot now to some questions that are coming in from our audience here, our participants. Yoka, we heard Katie reference this as well. For Yoka, what are the opportunities you see for improved partnerships between local government and community organizations and leaders to ensure that those most impacted are helping to drive decisions about solutions?
That's an awesome question. I think, throughout this decade, we've been creating roundtables with cities and mayors to make sure that they were up to date with the latest climate science and understand, you know, the roadmap that existed to take on solutions. I think one of the most enlightening projects we started was our community outreach. When we started with listening sessions in the community, we really wanted to hear what their needs were. And then we would bring local and city officials to meet with them to have an open dialogue of what those needs were. And so we hosted these town hall events, which actually Jim and Katie have participated in so many of them. And then we would bring into the practical solutions and start into looking at real tangible solutions that we can start implementing in those particular communities. We have also, you know, fostered community advocacy and empowerment. And so in a lot of our workshops, even in the most underserved communities, Black and brown communities in the county, we do letter writing workshops where people actually, you know, write a letter to the county commissioner, they write letters to their mayors, and so they do have their voice, and they do is part of the process as well. So I think one of I think the best way to foster communications is to have that inclusiveness, that open dialogue with all the community stakeholders that are going to be feeling the impacts and need to voice their opinions and need to be participatory of all these you know, life-changing decisions and, you know, budget decisions. Right now we have a major project ahead of us in Miami-Dade County with the Army Corps back-based studies. You know, we're talking about billions of dollars. This is something that is going to be affecting all of us. And half of our community residents are living under working, you know, are considered working poor. The majority of our residents do not know about this study. So I hope we can see a much more broader participatory from the Corps. I know the county had asked for an extension, and I applaud that. I applaud that the county asking for a 30-day extension, because the majority of the residents do not know about this, and they have a lot of questions. And we try to be the connectors and, you know, host webinars, informational, educational forums for this. But we just have to, you know, hear everybody's voices. We're all in this together.
Thanks, Shoka. So in the interest of time, we have time for one more. Dr. Moser, back to you. So what do you see as some of the core opportunities and best practices related to better communication by climate practitioners to the public and to frontline communities regarding climate change and sea level rise risk?
Wow, that's a mouthful. I think we heard a lot of it right now. I guess I want to point out one thing that might be maybe not as clear as I want to emphasize, which is so often communicators ask for what's the right message. You know, just tell me what the word is that I should use and what's the one sentence I should tell people so they, you know, as if I had a Coca-Cola sort of outreach budget and I could just put it into people's head. Well, that's not how it works. None of us have Coca-Cola outreach budgets, for one thing. If we have a person in charge, that's even something, right? But most of us don't. What Yoka just said is dialogue, right? So you actually are interested not just in throwing stuff at people, but you're interested in being in real dialogue and hearing from other people. That to me is in a context of we're making life and death decisions about billions of dollars, about the lives of peoples, that is exactly what we need. If there is one person in this audience that thinks they have it figured out and they just need to have a microphone, good luck to you. I don't think you do. Quite frankly, none of us do. We're doing the best we can, and we have to come to consensual decisions, or the best possible decisions, integrating the different concerns we have, the different interests we have. That means you have to learn about your audience. You have to be open to hearing, truly open to hearing, not just get input and buy-in, but like truly take the information that you're soliciting and changing what you do, because that would be a meaningful impact, right? They actually listen to me. Most evaluation of engagement shows us that people feel their voices weren't heard. Their input wasn't actually taken seriously. Well, I think then we have just failed it. You've not only wasted money, but you've actually failed an incredible opportunity to create a more democratic system, to break up old problems. We talk so much about mainstreaming climate change into whatever we do. well, whatever we did actually created the problems we have. Maybe we shouldn't be thinking so much about just mainstreaming more climate into it, thinking by some magic it would turn out better. We have to really rethink our systems. That is the conversation we're having with COVID and with the anti-racism movement right now. That is the opportunity. If we're not taking that, and if we're not humble to open a conversation to that, I don't think our climate communication is going to be very effective. So that's it's not a one message answer here, but open it up, you know? Maybe one other way to put that, you need content experts and you need context experts, both of them, content and context. And context is the people who are affected, the people who live in those neighborhoods. You need to hear from them as much as from your, you know, ACOMs and whatever, your consultants, your scientists. So I'll leave you with that. I could go on.
Right on.
You're on mute.
You're mute.
I have this silly thing at my hip, and I always scoot over and mute myself. So wisdom. I was saying, thank you, Yoka. Wisdom from Katie, from Susie, and from Yoka. I am grateful to all three of you. Really helpful thoughts today. I'm told that Whitney is back with us. Is that true? I think we're going to try to get back to whatever it is that I believe Whitney was talking about, the slips. Whitney, I see you, but I see that you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, I appreciate you letting me come back, Steve, after the panel there. This is sort of a cold and bloodless topic compared to the passion and excitement of the communications and other issues that the panelists brought up, and I so appreciate all of those. But I will go ahead and just finish up what I was talking about. These are the bills that we're talking about is what was referred to as Senate Bill 178, which is public financing of coastal construction projects. And I just want to pick back up, and I think we can move to the next slide. A lot of content in this bill, a lot of things that DEP needs to do and that we will be doing with public input. A couple of things to make note of. The rule is designed to be effective 1 year after it is finalized. Of course, as I mentioned before, we will have to go into rulemaking mode and all of that procedure. And then the rule would take effect a year after we finalize it. So there is some time. It gives us a year to get ready to implement this. And the rule will not be retroactive. In other words, the requirements that are placed upon constructors will apply to projects that are started not retroactively, but that will start during that 1 year getting ready period. Note that the study must assess flooding, inundation, etc., faced by the structure over its expected lifespan or 50 years, whichever is less. And this is where these unified projections really come into highlight, because by using those curves that have been developed and that expected lifespan, you can tell exactly, well, not exactly, but have a range of where sea level rise could be at that moment or at that time, at that point in time during the expected lifespan of the structure. Some things that the assessment is supposed to take into account: sea level rise, obviously, increased storm risk to the extent possible, subsidence of the land. These will require a lot of technical expertise. We will have to gather a lot of experts together to help us figure out how these standards will be folded into the assessments that we ask constructors to do. And some of this, I think, will be quite groundbreaking in terms of the positions that we look into. Next slide, please. I think it's really interesting that public safety is a big part of the bill. So the bill sponsors wanted to make sure that safety was part of it. Leakage of pollutants, electrocution and explosion hazards, floating or flying structural debris. These all need to be analyzed. So the potential of impacts from these things will need to be analyzed. And another thing that the assessment must do is provide alternatives for the coastal structures design and siting. And I think the way that we may look at implementing this is to help provide best practices, LID options, nature-based options, and other things to help constructors understand what other things they could do rather than an alternative that's potentially really vulnerable. Go ahead to the next slide. So what are the next steps? Whoops. Next steps for DEP, we need to define the parameters of the SLIP study. One of the most important pieces of that will be to develop a sea level rise projection that we can use in the implementation of this bill. The Unified Sea Level Projection that Southeast Florida has done, similarly over in Tampa Bay area, these are great examples of regional projections. And we will figure out how we make those dovetail into whatever we come up with. But I think even trickier will be figuring out contributions of subsidence and future storm risk. We have to come up with some way to manage all of these studies and keep these records for 10 years and make them publicly available. And of course, the rulemaking is always very complex, and I think this will be a chart topper in the complexity rating system. So I believe that's all the points I wanted to make today, and I will be happy to answer whatever questions I can.
Thank you, Whitney. Much appreciated. I'm glad we were able to get you back on the line so that you could finish the briefing on the rulemaking process. I think we have time for just one question, and it goes specifically to the issue that you just indicated with respect to your rulemaking. The question from the audience is that Southeast Florida and the greater Tampa region have both created regionally unified sea level rise projections, which include locally relevant data. Do you have a sense of how DEP may consider these regionally relevant projections within the rulemaking process?
Well, that's a great question, Steve, and I think it's going to be really important that we have representatives from these different resilience collaboratives participating with us to help figure out the best approach to this. This is serious plowing of new ground for us, and so we want all the important input that we can muster. I don't have a projection right now of how exactly this will be hammered out, but I can say that there will be a huge amount of input solicited from people that I can only characterize as stakeholders. Southeast Florida is a stakeholder, Tampa Bay area, everybody on the coast. So we will be looking for that kind of input to help us find the path.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Whitney. We're grateful. And hopefully the previous panel on communications can be helpful in that process as well.
Indeed. Thank you, Steve.
All right. Thanks. Thanks so much, Whitney. All right. So we are adapting in real time to technical issues. This is certainly the moment of Zoom and other sorts of online tools. We're spending our lives daily in more Zoom or online formats than I think any of us ever imagined possible. We're mindful that the Compact's updated sea level rise projection is being released at a momentous time in our history. A global pandemic that has caused the most significant economic downturn since the 1930s, the stark evidence of ongoing systemic racism and the grossly disparate health outcomes made evident by the pandemic, and now truly global protest movement for social justice that we've witnessed over the past month. Each day seems to bring new news on all of these and other fronts, and on our immediate future feels, at least to me, more uncertain than ever before. But as the Compact puts this latest sea level rise projection forward, we know that it will have a role in shaping future investments and policies across Southeast Florida. We have evidence over the past decade that the last two projections have done so. It's my hope that this panel now can offer some thoughts about past experience and what we're all learning in real time to point us toward the equitable and resilient Southeast Florida that we all hope to see. So joining me now, and I think we'll see some cameras coming on here. Okay, I see Jim Murley and I see Dr. Colon and Sasha. There is Sasha Forbes. Wonderful. Okay. So joining me now, Dr. Frances Colon of Jaspari Consulting, a seasoned diplomat. She's advised secretaries of state at the U.S. State Department on science and technology policy, evidence-based policy making, and also environmental affairs with respect to the Western Hemisphere. Also joining us is Sasha Forbes of the National Resources Defense Council, where she works with major cities across the country in developing inclusive investment strategies to advance sustainability and resilience. And I should say that Sasha also has had a role and continues to have a role in South Florida with respect to her role on the Broward County Climate Change Task Force. And I neglected to note that Dr. Colon previously served on the City of Miami's Sea Level Rise Task Force as well. So global experience, but local connections. And then of course, Jim Murley, the Chief Resilience Officer of Miami-Dade County. And a gentleman that has served in many, many roles of great importance at the local and regional and state level over the years. So Jim, I want to pivot to you. Given the sheer magnitude of this, I'm sorry? Okay. I thought I heard a buzz. Jim, the sheer magnitude of this pandemic recession that we've seen is quite remarkable. 40 million lost jobs and counting, huge losses in family and business income, a significant lost revenue for state and local governments as well. There's much talk about the possibilities of federal stimulus later this year or early next. We have no idea. But based on your experience in guiding the energy and climate allocations to Florida under the 2009 Recovery Act, what should local governments and our partners in civil society be doing now to prepare for future stimulus?
Good morning, Stephen. To all of my comrades at arms with the Compact and all of the audience, it's great to have the opportunity to participate, especially on this panel. So when I look back a little over 10 years, Steve, when you and I were involved, I was chairing the commission created by the legislature. You were our chief staff person. One observation personally is we couldn't have done this Zoom call meeting 10 years ago. You know, the technology has exponentially changed. That affects everything we do. It allows us to have these kinds of calls in lieu of meeting personally. It allows us, it should allow us a positive reinforcement to some of the things we could do better than we did 10 years ago. 10 years ago, you know, we faced another economic downturn at the time seemed very dramatic. And of course, Congress, as they will do, as a representative body, found that it needed to act fairly quickly, in that case, right after an election. It's probably an understatement to say when Congress acts, it's never an elegant outcome. And the bill that we dealt with implementing at the Florida level was probably representative of the kind of model that is going to happen either with a CARES 3 bill or with an infrastructure bill. They don't have a lot of time, and so therefore they're going to use either existing mechanisms. In 2009, it was the Energy Efficiency Block Grant Bill. We've seen that in recovery from hurricanes and even with the CARES Act, an increasing use of community development block grants, either in the standard format that our local governments use them or through a special disaster relief allocation. So in general, I think what we can expect is that Congress will use existing vehicles where it makes sense, but they're also apt to create some special programs on the spot, and they're going to have formulas and thresholds. And those are the things that can be unintentional. The CARES Act, too, I guess, had the 500,000 cutoff for local governments. I don't know where that number came from, but it left a lot of local governments in Southeast Florida not receiving CARES Act funding. That seems that, you know, if that's going to happen again, then as a group of local governments working together, we should be thinking about how those funds can best be allocated. I think the things that I would look for to prepare for whatever array of programs that Congress makes available directly to us as local governments, counties or cities, or through the process of granting funds to the state, which then involve a second set of reallocations, which we see most again after hurricanes, is to try to think of projects where we can gain multiple benefits from the allocation of these funds. Hopefully the flexibility will be there, but I think we need to look, especially for projects that, in addition to thinking about our flooding and sea level rise issues, we've got to think about much more about heat. I mean, more than the last month or the last week, we've had record-breaking heat. And I, for one, you know, was way underestimated the impact that this can have on top of the health conditions and the economics. So whenever we can factor in to fixed assets or other things that we ask for the money for to do, keep in mind, how can those be relief for heat for many of our population? I think we need fixed assets and mobile assets. I think we need to be thinking about how we might share and move resources. Last weekend, we had the pleasure of working with the Adrienne Aarts Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center in launching a mobile community resilience pod, which is essentially a shipping container completely repurposed for education on issues, including now the pandemic. And if you think about it, there's nothing more ubiquitous besides a shipping container for Southeast Florida, because we see them on the road, on the rail lines, on the ships. And it could be another type of mobile unit, but I think we need to be thinking not just fixed things, but of mobile things. We need to try to figure out as much as we can to share the dollars among jurisdictions and leverage them, either through interlocal agreements or other mechanisms. I think what we learned a little bit on the CARES Act, which is something we also tried to do in 2009, when the opportunity exists and the dollars can put in revolving loan programs, then they're going to help people, but the dollars will come back, and it's not a one-off program. So anything that allows for a refreshing of the dollars back into the system over time, I think is a model we should look for. And then finally, I think more than ever, we should be exhausting every avenue we can to figure out how to tie environmental justice and other equity issues into the process. It can be fairly rushed because, as in the CARES Act, they want the money spent by a given year, the end of the calendar year. So it's a lot of pressure, but I think it's an opportunity for all of us as local governments to prepare the best we can for whatever assistance we get from the federal government. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Jim. Sasha, I want to turn to you and in light of your work at NRDC, in particular in the SPARK program. You're connecting the dots between community level investments that build prosperity, health and well-being, and you're achieving sustainability and resilience objectives at the same time. Based on your work in cities across the country, what can Southeast Florida be doing now to ensure inclusive investment and building regional resilience as we look to restart our economy?
Thank you, Steve. And I'm gonna just turn off the video real quick so I don't have any interruptions, but then I'll turn it back. I'll turn it right back on. Okay, so I think what I shared with Steve and Lauren yesterday, that I definitely have some observations just even from my time and my interaction in South Florida, and being both an observer and a participant in conversations on equitable development for resilience level. So the first observation or kind of thought that I had around this was that we really have to accelerate gender, income, impacts on LGBT communities, and really being okay to push and grow in a different way. What really is that the people at times even right, governmental cooperation on adaptation, yet we have so much more work to do to give attention to equity challenges in our community. One of my mentors easier things and not raise issues that we have around maybe even white dominant ways of working and creating solutions. So we really, as just a baseline for about what are we talking about with equity? Is it from a corporate perspective or is it equity for liberation? And I think especially now with community uprisings and police brutality, really I think to hear me. Let me try and get my mic a little bit. Can you
Sasha,
hear me, Steve?
it sounds like your bandwidth might be dropping off for you. It's every 45 seconds or so, and then you come back.
Okay, I'm trying to fix it. Can you hear me now?
We can. Yes, brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So just long story short, for the first one, we have to accelerate and deepen conversations on race. That's just baseline. Deepen the discussion that we're having on tied to housing readiness. It's tied to addressing displacement. It's tied to understanding what type of community people see and want for themselves. A couple months ago, the Spark Project, we worked on a literature review, and I'll actually drop this link in the chat. Maybe Lauren or others can share it. And we focused on a survey of practitioners and a literature review from across the country on the link between climate change and displacement in an effort to understand, what we already know and live through. I really love Dr. Moser talking about like context and content, but we were trying to figure out, what is the relationship between the pressures that are exerted by climate change and the unintended consequences of climate change adaptation. And so and lastly, transit-oriented development, energy efficiency and solar, things that are tied mostly to like increases in property values. So in view and what is the role of community ownership, for example, in dealing with displacement? How are we thinking about community land trust, right? There might be okay, we're still having an issue. Would you all like me to? I can try and call back.
Hey, Sasha. Yes. We hear you brilliantly for a moment, and then it sounds like the connection is a little hinky. And I'm realizing I'm speaking here on mute. Sorry. So, Dr. Colon, I was just saying how delighted I am that you were able to join us, and observing that good public policy is driven by evidence assembled to inform decision making. Your work at the State Department advising the Secretary of State on science and technology issues, as well as Western Hemisphere environmental issues, really embodies this principle. What lines of evidence should decision makers in Southeast Florida be assembling now to ensure equitable resilience investments as we look to restart the regional and national economies? And you're on mute, Dr.
No,
Colon.
I'm on mute. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for the great work that Compact does. I'm really happy to be here with my friends, Jim and Yoka. I think that in my experience, it's really a combination of having good data evidence, knowing how to frame it and put it in front of decision makers in the best possible way for it to be actionable. Here in South Florida, what are the things that we need to consider? I think that a lot of times decision skews in favor of protecting the most valuable assets. Because we have a system where, you know, property values and then property taxes drive a lot of our economy, right? And so how do you incorporate elements like the public health of our community? How do you incorporate elements such as the median income and the wages? How do you incorporate the cost benefit of choosing one option over the other, including an equity lens? As you look at the projections and the projections that you put out and update and provide information for decision makers, how are they using that together with the other information about the social determinants of health and other things that need to be incorporated? And so we need to have an active approach in terms of how we influence the decision-making equation and what goes into it. And I think that that's what's, as much evidence as you can throw at a decision maker, it won't make a difference if it's not translated, if it's not incorporated into an equation for making decisions that incorporates that equity lens. So I think a lot about the mechanisms we have in place to take that evidence and move it through that decision-making process. Providing a report is one way, and people like Jim and others take that data and use it directly. But there's a lot of steps in that decision-making process, right? And a lot of decision makers in that decision-making process. And so what are the mechanisms that we have available to influence those decisions and to help Jim and give him what he needs, for example, as he's making the pitch for the decisions that incorporate that equity lens, right? We have boards that incorporate civilians and experts to provide expertise and oversight. How relevant are those? How much teeth do they really have? Are they good to have? Is it nice to be able to say you created one, or do they really have the power to influence and to insert themselves in the decision-making process to help those people like Jim or Jane at the city, for example, here in Miami, that are doing the actual work in the front line? Organizations on the ground. You have a Miami Climate Alliance that incorporates amazing organizations doing the climate education like CLIO, et cetera. How much support do they have to be able to advocate through the right channels, to keep tabs on the decisions that are coming up in commissions at the state level, et cetera. How much leverage do these organizations have? So one of the things that to me is very important is how do they receive the support, financial, expert-wise, to do the work that we need them to do, right? The way to get at a better decision-making process is to have the advocates in the front lines that take your report and your updated projections, that take the information from the academics, that then correlate that to the decisions that are going to be made, right? What bill is on tap? What decision is the commission making in the next month? And then you're able to have a coordinated effort, but that takes investment. And as long as it's the same few advocating to the same few with minimal resources, it is very hard to get these decision-making processes to shift the way we want to see them shift. We need the communicators, in addition to Cleo, in addition to Dr. Moser, we need more academics and experts to get involved in the platforms of the community. It's great to have good data and good research. We need them out in public, speaking openly and vividly about the impacts and what considerations are not being taken under advisement, etc. So we need to be conversant in government speak, but also we need to be able to incorporate the community speak, right? And so I think those are all the things that, to me, evidence is of course the core, but all of these elements need to be incorporated in order to really have an advocacy agenda that really gets at moving the needle on these issues. We need to be advocating for the stronger seawalls, the green infrastructure, but also an economy that's diversified from property taxes. And we need to be challenging our state and our county and our city on incentives for gentrification. And we need to be challenging them on the lack of green spaces to be able to absorb these rain bombs. And we need to be able to speak government speak, but incorporate all these things. Like Jim said, heat is a huge consideration here. The last few days have been brutal. We need to be able to factor that in. When we're speaking sea level rise, we need to be able to talk about these impacts, to talk about them openly, and I think that losing that fear, requires the investment in the organizations that are going to be doing the speaking, that are going to be advocating. And what does that mean? That means foundations needs to step in. That means that that granting needs to step in to really empower these voices. If I had all the money in the world, I would give it to Cleo and have them storm the halls in Tallahassee during session every day, because they are walking the talk, right? And that is what we need, right? People that are conversant in government speak, people that can advocate for the community, that they're integrating all this language and that are hitting the ground.
Thank you, Dr. Colon. So I am told that we've reestablished a better, more solid connection with Sasha. Sasha.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And I jumped in right at a time when Dr. Colon was definitely raising the issues that I had on my list to go down. So she said it even clearer and more direct. So I definitely want to echo, ditto, double stamp, rubber stamp, a lot of what she was saying about that communication. I wanted to just, I don't know where you all heard or what I might have dropped off saying, but I wanted to pick up one piece around the data, right? Which is not data to have data in itself, but to the point of, do we even have the right information to be able to communicate what is happening? So last year, the Broward Climate Change Task Force, we created an equity subcommittee, and one of the projects we immediately identified was how we understanding the climate change impacts for communities in Broward, like where are the food deserts, where are the deepest energy burdens, what are the elevations? And what the information that we got back, not one of them was disaggregated by race. Not one of them was really breaking down what it is that was happening and why. Where are the overlays for redlining? Where are the overlays for communities that might have been segregated in the past? And I think both Dr. Colon and Jim mentioned heat. And there's been some work, and we already know this without even looking at the data,
But how does that intersect with tree canopy, right? And again, redlining and segregation. How do all of those things intersect for then when we talk about investments that need to come into the community to know where, why, and who's being impacted? What is that level of understanding that local government has? And then be able to understand when groups like CLEO and Miami Climate Alliance and are coming and speaking and sharing information, that there could be more of that two-way conversation because local government themselves have done their homework. So it's not just, I think, enough for us to say that we do have to get more people. We do have to have the organizers. We definitely have to be able to fund and give power and resources to the local groups, and local government also has to continue to do that work of pushing, even if we're looking at the sea level rise projections. Where's the part 2 of that document? The part 2 that is funded and fully understands what the vulnerabilities of sea level rise are from an equity perspective. So that's something that if could be created under the compact as a next step, is something that I think we definitely need to be able to have to understand even more when equitable development is being created, equitable to whom and for what purpose and how.
Thank you, Sasha. I appreciate that. And the importance of local governments doing their homework, I think, cannot be underscored any more strongly, at least in my mind. I must say, the human mind is really quite a remarkable thing, isn't it? I have felt personally the degree of uncertainty over the last 6 months. I have felt it intensely. And I realize that at any day of anyone's life, really the future is terribly uncertain. But to the extent that we're in a routine, to the extent that, you know, last week kind of unrolled as perhaps, you know, one would expect, you know, I could walk out and get smacked by a bus tomorrow. You know, that reality of that uncertainty, our mind tends to really underscore how certain the future might be, when in fact it's not. Now we're feeling this. It feels very difficult to contemplate what's in the future. And even as we think about sea level rise projections, right, we're talking about things that have accrued and are continuing to accrue, but the primary impacts are downstream. They're still some years out. It's hard to think past next week at this point. So I am offering an opportunity for my panelists, and maybe I'm even doing more. I'm asking for a little bit of some foresight, right? Take us forward into the future, please. I think many would be delighted to have 2020 behind us, but imagine, if you will, that it's 2030. Right, and you're looking back a decade. You're looking back at 2020. From a prosperous Southeast Florida that has experienced another decade's worth of sea level rise, as our sea level rise projections suggest. But the region is adapting well for everyone who lives in Southeast Florida. So from that rather hopeful future standpoint, what did local governments and other actors do in 2020 to make that hopeful pathway possible? So Jem, I invite you to get us started.
Well, 10 years looking back or 10 years looking forward it's a challenge. I think in 2030, I think that we will have taken the steps, because the compact has developed a brand around our ability to project sea level rise, and our recognition that it's not a fixed projection, but it has to be done every 5 years. If we really look honestly at that, it's amazing that now even the Corps of Engineers comes in and says, how can we get in sync with your projections? We need to do that for other data. We need to own the data around heat, health, and jobs tied to the things we do. And we need to issue that in a way that people don't feel like they have to pay another consultant another X amount of money for every project we do, but they can go to the compact and find the data that is the best available data, and we're going to update it. I think that's that data issue, which I've heard through both panels, is very important, and I think it's our brand. We need to build on it. I think in 2030 we should have developed also a better way of visually observing what's happening to our environment around us. I mean, let's face it, folks, there's cameras everywhere today watching what we do. And that's only gonna get bigger. In Europe and other places, it's exponentially greater than what we have in this country. It's a balance of privacy. We could take webcams of everything that happens in the flooding environment, in the sea level rise environment, and have that online so people can actually see it. There's no substitute for connecting what we talk about with seeing things. I think we need a lot of groundbreaking for projects that we can identify as going into this. And quickly to how do we get there from where we are, we need to encourage, and cajole, and embarrass our federal, state, and regional partners to make the projects we do more coordinated. We just have got to get out of this box where one program does one thing, and we've got to figure out how to make the links. You know, we could spend an hour on this, but I think we can do that in the next 10 years for additional outcome. And I think that, I know Sasha talked about the energy efficiency and conservation and greenhouse gas reduction piece. That's got to be part of what we do. And then finally, my final comment would be, I think today and in 2020, we should exhibit an air of confidence. We know how to do this. We have done it over the history of Southeast Florida. We have the best people in place. We have university experts. We have good NGOs, a private sector that wants to talk about economic resilience. If we advance that over the next 10 years, we'll be the place people want to come to figure out how to do this. But we have to have that sense of confidence and be willingness to make mistakes as we do the work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Sasha, so looking back from this imaginary post in 2030, and what did we get right in the region at this crazy year of 2020? Sasha, maybe looks like you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So I think one of the foresights for me is that, or one of the things for me is that we really had the foresight to understand that if we keep piling onto a broken system, what we experience in the future is going to be much worse than what we experience now. And so because we had that foresight, we were able to have conversations that dealt specifically on race, and I'm gonna keep saying that just because of how I'm experiencing it. We would have provided the funding and the resources for groups to do the work that they need to do, for community leaders to be able to have access to the information, the resources, the funding, the money, to work in a different way. That we have figured out that protecting and valuing people's health and safety, particularly our new terminology around essential workers, right? That we would have figured out many more ways to provide the resources for people who are at greater health risk, greater vulnerabilities to climate change, and for health impacts. It's making sure that we provided funding for equitable and sustainable access to affordable housing, looking at clean energy and clean water issues for right now and for the crisis, to be able to deal with things in the future, and investing in equitable community infrastructure that really promotes the health and resilience of community so that we can really build back stronger and making a greater emphasis on an economy that works not for the few, but an economy that can work for more specifically low income and people of color.
Thank you, Sasha. Dr. Colon.
And I just want to echo Sasha's comments right on the nose. I think that when we look back, we will have seen that we will have diversified the economy to sources of revenue for our cities and counties that don't depend on one element only. And that will translate into a diversity of jobs and ways for us to get to wages where our people are empowered to make decisions for themselves and their families. I think we'll have updated our building codes to and made the tough decisions that need to be made now so that we can build resilience into our entire system. I think land use will have been rethought. And we won't be scared to talk about certain buybacks that need to happen and demanding federal money for some buybacks for that to happen and for parks to be created in areas where we need to have them and those green spaces. I think green infrastructure will be valued and not seen as a view obstruction to coastal properties. Instead, it'll be seen as something that enhances your property, as a commitment to the community. I think our oversight mechanisms will have actual power to them, and our ability to put those in place and have the commitment of elected leaders to creating mechanisms where the community can come in and speak and actually hold people accountable, not just check a box. I think fragmentation, which Jim mentioned, in the many tiny municipality governments and the decision in the process and the initiatives in each one, I think we're not going to value fragmentation as much, and we're going to see value in condensing efforts and bringing those together. I think we'll also learn how to live with, as you said, uncertainty as not as something that paralyzes us from moving forward, but it's something we incorporate into our daily lives. If we think about COVID as an example, it's impossible for us to know all of the impacts that COVID has on the health of all different age groups right now. Why? Because we've never encountered this before and we're living it. We're building this plane as we're flying it. But each month, each week, each day, we learn a little bit more. And our research gets better and our projections get better. And being able to live with what we know and use that effectively and incorporate the uncertainty into our personal decisions will be something that we do as a result of this experience and of the climate change experience that we'll do with more ease. Instead of that feeling uncomfortable, I need science to tell me exactly what's going to happen tomorrow or the week after. We'll understand that that isn't the truth, that isn't real for anything in our lives, and that this is one more of those places. And we will hold our leaders accountable to that, and we'll say, you need to incorporate this uncertainty for us into your decision making. And finally, I think the investments in advocacy at the federal and state level, we won't be as held back from demanding what is our right and what is ours and what we deserve from our representatives in Congress and from our representatives in Tallahassee. Those investments need to be made in this community, and we'll know how to ask for it, how to frame the ask, and we'll know how to make it very uncomfortable for them when they are not taking care of their community down here.
Thank you, Dr. Colon. So we have a question from the audience for the panel. So for the three of you, are there any teams or community boards or local staff working to identify specific metrics that result in equitable outcomes, like sea level rise impacts based on property value versus the number of people, and core issues that drive health impacts by zip code, like affordable housing fees versus building inclusive communities? And I think this is across the Southeast Florida region. Any Jim or Sasha, awareness of any of this sort of work?
I'll go in it personally and say I don't know that this is happening in the region. And I think that was to my comment earlier about what the task force is trying to look at now is gathering up even the baseline of where are things happening and to whom are they happening, especially because we don't have the data that's even disaggregated by race and income. So that's kind of a first step that the committee is working on, and I would have to check with the task force generally to see if they're advancing, this question of equitable outcomes based on the type of climate issues. So if anybody else knows, jump in the chat and add it.
Thanks,
Steve,
Sasha. Yeah, Jim.
And Katie, a previous panel is our point person on developing the county's sea level rise strategy, which is a broad strategy that we were able to design the scope for and are trying to fix and coordinate the projects like the core projects we've talked about. And they have got a structure there, which I won't do justice to, but in looking at different approaches to dealing with sea level rise long term, they've established some criteria of which fairness and equity is one of the ones we're trying to embed now, so that the county decision makers look at that at the same time they're looking at other things, cost benefit, as we move forward. I don't know that our work at this point has gotten to the numerical standards. It's pointing us that direction and trying to have that level playing field as we make some decisions as we go forward. We'll hopefully have that report out for the public to review and the compact. Everything's been sort of held up by the decision making around the pandemic, but I believe that we're moving down that path, but I'm not sure that the answer to the question that we've established the numerical standards. And I think that could be something that we do with the Broward Task Force, Climate Change Task Force, and our partners throughout the compact.
I couldn't agree. So Katie, I saw you pop in on camera there briefly. Did you have Katie Hageman?
Sorry, I just wanted to add that I think, as Jim alluded to, we do have equity as one of the key principles for how we adapt to sea level rise at the county level. But going back to the earlier points, I think it's also important that we be really explicit about the history that brought us to this point. So using, for example, the Army Corps of Engineers process, that relies on determining the cost-benefit ratio, which is tied to property values. Those property values have been explicitly shaped by racist and segregation in the past. And so the effects, even in 2020, almost 100 years after redlining, still reflect the impacts of those decisions and what's been made in the past. So even though, we have flexibility in our decision making at a more local level in terms of how we make decisions, I think it's also important as professionals that we engage with all of our partners at the state, federal, and other levels to try and ensure that we're doing all that we can to try and unravel some of those systems that continue to perpetuate that inequality.
Well said, Katie. Thank you. I think the point here is that these data exist as well. They do, and the ability to kind of aggregate these data is really it I think is part and parcel of what I think Sasha is challenging local government to do their homework and to put these data together. I think that as we think about kind of assembling the lines of evidence, as we think about understanding some of the communications challenges, and really, I think the takeaway from our esteemed communications panel was really authentic dialogue. So I think those two pieces together point the way towards putting us on a pathway as we come out of the recession, the pandemic, and move forward to this kind of hoped for 2030 cycle. I want to conclude the panel, and I want to thank Dr. Colon. I want to thank Sasha Forbes, and I want to thank Jim Murley for their thoughts, and I want to show appreciation for all of our presenters, Whitney Gray, Yoka Arditi Rocha, Dr. Mosier, and Katie Hageman for sharing their time and their expertise. I want to thank all of those who have dialed in. The participants, the participation this morning has been quite remarkable. We will be posting a recording of the webinar and Whitney's presentation on the Compact's website in the coming days, and an email will be sent to all webinar participants with links to those resources. Finally, the Compact has created an informational resource for the general public on sea level rise, which is designed for the general public. And will be produced in English, Spanish, and Creole. This document is intended to be shared widely with the public and will be released in the Compact's next newsletter in mid-July. We are eager for feedback on that resource, and we very much look forward to your thoughts in ongoing engagement. Thank you all for all that you're doing. I wish each and every one of you health and well-being, thank you all for taking some time to join us today. This concludes our webinar.